These are the top 5 webcams under $100. And at the end of this video, I'll be showing all these webcams in a quadrant just like this so that you can compare them all side by side. But since there's only 4 slots, I'll have to swap one in and out just like I'm doing right here. All these webcams can and should be controlled in OBS, but if there are any software specific features that I think that you should use, then I'll mention that as I talk about each individual webcam. At number 5 is the Logitech C930e. This is the oldest webcam of these by far. It came out way back in 2013. It doesn't quite match up to the rest of the webcams on this list, but it's still decent. I've seen this for about $80 recently, but links to the current prices of all these webcams will be below. This records at up to 1080p, 30 frames per second, and it has a 90-degree field of view. So it's basically like the Logitech Brio before the Brio came out. It can't do 60 frames per second and it cannot do 4K, but it has very similar framing and colors. Speaking of the colors, it is a little bit too yellow. The sharpness is pretty decent, not amazing. For most people that are going to be using this for streaming or video conferencing, or if you're going to have this like for gameplay and you have it in the lower right or the lower left, this should be more than enough. The main advantage of this over the C920 is the better color accuracy, but like I said, it does get a little bit too yellow. You'll see that more as I compare the rest of the webcams. Now the autofocus on this is not the fastest, but it is resistant to pulsing, so you don't have to worry about it phasing in and out. But if you hold something up to the webcam like I'm demonstrating right here, it just might not catch it. Sometimes it's just like, I don't want it. So let's see if I can actually get it to lock on right here. Yeah, just like most of these webcams, they're really trying to lock onto your face. They can catch something else if you put it close to it, but they're not very consistent at it, especially this one. Since this webcam is so old, it's the only one where the settings do not persist past a restart or if you unplug and replug the camera, except the last webcam on this list. That one has some issues with that as well. I'm not entirely sure why, and they might be able to fix it with software. The build is very standard for Logitech. There's 1/4-inch threading. It comes with a privacy cover. The cable is 60 inches, non-detachable, USB 2.0. With the C930, the biggest issue with it is it cannot turn left and right. That's why the angling is a little bit weird in this video. Overall, the C930 is alright, but let's move on to the more exciting stuff. Number 4 is the Razer Kiyo Pro. I bought this when it first came out for $200, and I've seen it go down all the way to about $80 when it's on sale. Usually though, it's around $99. This webcam can do 1080p 60 frames per second in uncompressed YUI2. At the time of launch, the colors were way better than the rest of the competition, though a lot of the competition has caught up, as you'll see in this video. Also, the amount of grain is way lower than the webcams at the time. I suspect they're using some sort of a noise reduction filter that you cannot turn off because it's not really that sharp. The colors overall are good, but the reds are a little bit too orangish. Reds, pinks, they just lean into that orange range a little bit too much. You can see it in my skin tone. But the rest of the colors are really good. This has an adjustable field of view from between 80 degrees, 90 degrees, and 103 degrees. You can control this in Razer Synapse. After using this for several years, I would definitely stick with that 80 degrees because if you get any wider, it starts to have more and more of a fisheye effect. This also has a high dynamic range effect, which caps the webcam to 30 frames per second. The only time I'd ever use this is if you have a window to your back, but I would also not record with a window to my back without blackout curtains. Now, the main weakness with my Razer Kiyo Pro is the autofocus. It pulses like crazy, though it can snap onto objects, but if you're moving, not a lot, but just a little, then the webcam tends to pulse a lot, or if you're doing any sort of hand movements or anything like that. The newer Kiyo Pros, there was a firmware update to improve the autofocus, but since mine was the original batch, it is incompatible with the firmware update. So if you get a newer one, you probably don't have to worry about this that much. The cable on the webcam is 60 inches, USB-C to A, USB 3.0. It's detachable and braided. It comes with a privacy cover, and the adjustability is good, even though it does take some time to get used to. Number 3 is the Elgato Facecam Neo. I bought this for $80 and I've seen it on sale for even as low as about $60. Elgato had a sale right before I made this video. This records at up to 1080p, 60 frames per second in MJPEG. Now this manages to do this even with USB 2.0, but since it's 2.0, that compression, you can really see it mostly in the color accuracy. There are just some colors that are gone, they're missing, they're replaced. So for example, like right here on my forehead and just on my skin in general, the browns, some of the shades are just gone, so they're replaced with a little bit of green. The sharpness is good, even better than the Kiyo Pro actually. That said, the grain is a little bit too much. You can see it especially at full screen, but if you make it smaller, you can't really see it all that much. This is a field of view of 77 degrees. Just like the other webcams, the Facecam Neo autofocus does work sometimes, but it's very much trying to stay locked onto your face. So It's definitely not something that if you want to be putting something up to the webcam and then taking it away that I would rely on, but it is technically possible to do it. Like most of this list, this has HDR that works well. It only works when the device is at 30 FPS. You can control this using Elgato Camera Hub. Camera Hub really gives you more precision in the controls for changing the ISO value. If you're trying to control in the OBS and you want to change the stop of the exposure or make the ISO just a little bit more, a little bit less, you don't get quite as granular of control. As you can't see the exact shutter speed numbers in OBS. The build has pros and cons. I love the privacy shutter that you can slide. The ability to twist it horizontally and angle it up and down is great. Unfortunately, it's USB-C without an adapter in the box, and the cable is only 55 inches and non-detachable. Number 2 is the OBSBOT Meet SE. I bought this for $70. You can do 1080p, 60 frames per second in MJPEG. This webcam has incredible detail for the price, but as I demonstrated in my full review, it looks even better as far as the sharpness when you decrease the noise reduction filter. The default is on medium. If you take it off, it's a little bit sharper, but it's grainier. So I've left it on medium because that's just what the default is, and I think it overall looks good. This has excellent colors. I'd say the best colors of all of these webcams. And has very impressive dynamic range. And if I didn't mention already, dynamic range is the ability to see the detail in the colors in very dark areas and very light areas as well. So you'll see some of the other webcams and some of the bright areas, they get a little bit blown out. Mostly you'll see this in this last webcam and the C930, but this does a very good job of evening out the lighting. I would say of all these webcams, this one's actually the best value, but the sheer resolution of number 1 is why I put it higher. This has a 78-degree field of view, which is perfect for my use case, really good for most people's use cases. When I put this up to the webcam, it's going to be overexposed, but I just want to actually demonstrate the autofocus so that you can see some of the text up at the top. And then back to my face. I really like how snappy this autofocus is. Boom, right there. This has HDR in the software if you need it, and there's a ton of different effects in OBSBOT Center. While there is slightly more grain than I'd like, this webcam looks fantastic overall. And this is the tiniest build of these webcams, and while it's called parlor trick, it would have been better to just make it larger so all the pieces don't have to attach magnetically. This can be flipped vertically to record portrait mode content, but the rotation activation is very inconsistent. This has a 60-inch cable USB-C to C, even though the device is USB 2.0, and there's an adapter included in the box. Now, the number 1 best webcam under $100 is the AnkerWork C310. I bought mine for exactly $99.99. The reason this crushes all the other webcams on this list is for the sheer resolution. It's the only webcam on this list that can record it up to 4K. So it's 4K, 30 frames per second. It can also do 1080p 60. I will show that very shortly. So when it comes to sharpness, clarity, detail, there's no comparison between this and the rest of them when you put it at full screen. The grain is relatively low as well. Now, some of the weaknesses, I wouldn't say weaknesses, but where it's not necessarily quite as strong, I'll actually go back and forth between the SE really quickly, the Meet SE, is the color accuracy. The color accuracy, it might look a little bit yellowish on my wall, but it actually is an off-white wall back there. This one has a little bit of extra red. It just doesn't quite get that white balance right. Also, the skin tone on my face, it's good, but not quite as good as the Meet SE. This has an adjustable field of view from between 65 degrees, 78 degrees, and 95 degrees. 95 is what's at right now. I think it's a bit too much, but I framed it so that it looks decent, but there's a lot of stuff in the background that doesn't really necessarily need to be there. But I kept it at 95 because that preserves the image quality because it's a digital zoom. Now, the autofocus is hit or miss even if you have the face priority turned off. And for most use cases, that's still fine. It's just that, again, as I'm showing with all these webcams, not a single one of these webcams has really been able to lock this in easily. It's going to be difficult to hold objects up to it. And if you are recording anything besides your face, it can be annoying. So the dynamic range is pretty good, but if you are in an extreme environment, you can turn on HDR in the software. The limitation of that is it only works at 1080p and it drops the frame rate to 30, even though it says 60 in the software. So I probably wouldn't bother with it, and I just spend the effort to optimize the recording space if possible. Also, the C310 does have some issues with the settings persisting, specifically not just on a restart, but if you close like OBS, for example, then open it back, the colors are going to be like blown out, or they're going to be like a little bit too overexposed or underexposed. Just your settings, they don't stay exactly. So if you have an exposure value of like -6 in OBS, you close it, you open it back, it'll still say all those settings, but the colors will be, or the brightness will be completely off. You have to click that again to ensure that it's actually the correct value. So that's something that's annoying with this. Is some sort of a bug. Now here's what the C310 looks like at 1080p 60 frames per second, a lot more fluid. That said, I probably would not get this webcam specifically to use it at 1080p 60 because the other webcams are, besides the C930, are just going to be a better value for that use case. I'd say get this specifically if you want to use the 4K. Also, when you drop this down to 1080p or you swap back and forth 1080p to 4K, you're going to have to change the settings again because the exposure values don't really match up when you change the resolution and frame rate. The build of the C310 is a bit lacking. You cannot rotate it and it's pretty bulky, but it does have a privacy shutter that's inside. The wire is 60 inches, USB-C to A. All of these budget webcams have pretty whack cables, honestly, way too short unless you're on a laptop. Now here's 4 of these webcams side by side. First, I've omitted the C310. I'll throw that in at the end and replace it for the Logitech C930e. Aside from the C930e, all of these webcams really go blow for blow with each other in a lot of different areas. And this is when you start to see some of the differences in the white balance specifically. And currently these are all at 1080p 60 frames per second, except the C930, which you're going to see a lot more of that motion blur because that can only do 1080p 30 frames per second. Now with the C310 included, we can see how much better this webcam is than the rest of them when it comes to that detail. But since it is in a lot smaller of a frame, you can't see quite to the same degree as when it was full screen. But it is 30 frames per second, so it's not as smooth. Overall, you won't be disappointed with any of these webcams, maybe with the C930, but the rest of the 4, with the proper knowledge of lighting and settings, you can make all of these webcams look very good for video conferencing and for even making videos if you wanted to stream, all that. But the AnkerWork C310 is definitely the most viable if you want to be an actual streamer, because if you're going to be putting your face full screen, that 4K resolution is really going to help. At 1080p 60 frames per second, they've all got that same smoothness, but since the playing field has been evened out a bit in terms of the sharpness, then I would go for the OBSBOT Meet SE. I do find it to be the best of these webcams, but all 4 right now look really good. But of course, I ultimately recommend the AnkerWork C310. It's currently the best webcam under $100.